It's so great to see all these faces, these little images on the screen. So I want to start with thanks, and I have some screens to share. So this is the first of what I hope to be a series, Modern Evolution of English Dance. This one is Musical Roots. I mean, it's very much a team effort. There's no way I could have done this on my own. I've been dreaming of this for years before Zoom, when I'm thinking of a different route. Once Zoom started, I had to figure out how to do it. And the answer to that was to get help. My help is manyfold. We have the Boston CDS Boston Center, big time help, sponsor of this event and also financial supporter. And we have the Musical Roots team, a bunch of people. I can't believe how much time and effort they put into making this happen. In particular, Christine, Tom, and Hal, I've leaned on them time and time again to figure out how to make this work well. Besides the team, there's a big part of this, another big piece that's the collaboration that made this work, and that's Jacqueline Schwab. We worked very hard together, designing the program, figuring out what we wanted to say and how to do it, and I'm very grateful for that. And Edmund Robinson, who is Jack's home-based tech support, he has done such a great job of making things happen. Let's see what's next. Oh, these are the people who meant a lot to me, and it was things that they gave me that inspired me to do this sort of thing, the people and the organizations. In particular, I dedicate to this day, this presentation, to the memories I have of Phil Merrill and de Helena Cornelius. So the event is free. We appreciate donations. We have a tip jar. We'll post this in the chat later on as well. We're doing a recording. We'll make that available on the Boston Center website in the future. This is the first of a series, and we'll post what those others are later. And now, there we go. So I've had a lifetime of asking, how did this happen? When did this occur? Why? A whole bunch of questions. In the English country dance world, it started with me as a teenager going dancing and believing naively that I was doing 17th century dances in a 17th century style and with 17th century music. And it took a little while to be dissuaded from that. And then I realized that what we're really doing is modern dances on those patterns with similar music played in a modern style, but there was still so much I didn't know what went into that. I've been fascinated all the time about how things came and changed. So this particular presentation started with a chance exchange I had with Jacqueline at some dance camp. She made the offhand remark that Cecil Sharp's arrangements were related more to the Romantic period and the music of the 20th century, the early 20th century that he lived in. And that had my brain spinning. I wanted to know, well, how did the music sound in the Baroque times? How did it sound in between? What were the rules? How did the rules change? It reminds me of a story I have. I came to a band workshop at Pinewoods, probably in 1975. Marshall Barron was teaching. I was playing accordion then, and she had these rules of how to play good dance music. And they were perfect for me. I thought it was a brilliant workshop, particularly for me at that time. And I took it all in. And then I went back home to Berkeley and I did a dance with Chuck. And I listened and I thought, but he's not following those same rules. He's going beyond them. And I was fascinated by that. I felt like Chuck knew how to break the rules. He knew how to go beyond them, or maybe it's just there was another level that was truly a level beyond what I could do, but I could listen to it, I could hear it. Chuck would play these soft chords with this occasional offbeat that would pick us up and keep us up for another round of soft chords. Yum, beep, yum. And I thought it was just gorgeous. And so that's a big theme here. What are the rules? What are the rules of the music throughout this period of time? So let me now turn to Jacqueline Schwab with a question. Jacqueline Schwab, music teacher, researcher, dancer, and longtime friend. Jacqueline, one of Cecil Sharp's gifts to dancing were his piano arrangements. When did you first meet them, and what do they sound like?
I fell in love with English dancing in high school, and starting age 15, and maybe junior or senior year, I got the chicken pox. And when you get them when you're that old, you're sick for a while. So I was home for 2 weeks, and I had just happened to take out of the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh this tome of country dance arrangements by Cecil Sharp. It was before they were rebound into a smaller volume. It was a huge book. And I had a lot of music paper, and I had 2 weeks or whatever to work. And so I just copied them all out during those 2 weeks. I forget about high school, but I copied them all out, and I sort of imprinted on them. And I guess that's the start. I think I'll play you one. So these are arrangements that he created somewhere in the early 19-teens. So here's King of Poland a la Cecil Sharp. So a little different than maybe you heard anybody play these days. It was very angular, even though surprisingly the Cecil Sharp style was very forward-leaning. But he created these, I think, for people so he could go around the U.S. and the U.K. and just hand these arrangements to probably classical pianists and just say, here, if you play this, we can dance to it. So after I moved to Boston in 72, somewhere after that, in my early 20s, I started playing for English dancing, and I drew on many ideas in those arrangements. But I wasn't a very curious person, I guess, and I never thought, where did they come from? But it was the start of my ideas for playing for dancing, and we'll explore that. And many of you will know this, but I'll just say that our dances that we dance today, we draw from dances published back to 1651, and then there's manuscripts from before that. Late 19th century dances collected in the countryside by Sharp and the Kennedys, etc. And then this wealth of modern choreographies, especially in the last 20 or so years. And some of those use historical tunes. But we don't dance in period style, and period style changed from year to year a lot from the Renaissance or the Elizabethan age until the 18th century. Big changes, and big changes when Cecil Sharp reconstructed the dances. So it's not how we dance today. And if you try to, in a way, dance the way we dance today to people just playing period music reconstructed, it might not work, because of many reasons. I just want to give you a basic dance musician's concept before we dive in a little bit. Is that not every bit of dance music around the world, but probably much of it would have two elements. One is the and the other is the pa. And the shows the dancers where to put your feet. And this would be the pas, and that lifts you up and takes you to the next step. And you can have many different styles of dancing that would call on those ums and pas. And as Brad said, you don't have to literally play them all the time. They're just sort of they're in the air. You have to, every dance musician has to feel them, but you don't necessarily have to play them, especially if you're as savvy a player as Chuck Ward is in California. So we're going to dive back to the Renaissance era, and this is just going to be very brief. I'm not going to expound on each era, and I'm not an expert on each era, but I'll give you just a little bit so you can listen to tunes from those eras and have something for which to listen to. So the Renaissance era, we're talking basically 1400 to 1600, and Queen Elizabeth died something like 1602 or 1603. So that's before the Jameses and Charles getting beheaded, and 1651 Playford. And a key source for us for that is the Fitzwilliam Virginal book. It was a manuscript book that eventually found its way to Cambridge, and now you can buy a modern edition of it. And it has this rich lore of music from that era, arrangements in complex Renaissance arrangements. And you'll find some English country dance tunes in there. Sellinger's Round, The Way We Know It, which Sharp plucked out of there, is in that book. And I can't remember the name. I think that's Goddesses, Quadling's Delight. Anyway, a number of our country dance tunes are in there. And we're talking in days way before the piano. And so you'd be getting keyboard instruments like the virginals, which is a harpsichord strung crosswise, but it's basically a plucked instrument. You don't get dynamic range in that. You can't have loud and soft. It's all one thing unless there's tricks you can use. And you also don't have any pedal, so you can't hold notes down or blur them together, something we pianists love to have. And you also had a much shorter range. Maybe most of them stopped. So the piano has 3 more octaves. So sometimes we pianists in modern country dancing love to hit those low notes or play on the high notes. Well, that, at least on a keyboard instrument, just was not on in the Renaissance, and for quite a while. I'm going to play you a favorite Renaissance tune of mine that appears twice in the Fitzwilliam Virginal book, and might have been sung by Ophelia in Hamlet. It's thought, or at least according to Wikipedia. It's the long name is My Robin to the Greenwood is Gone, or Is to the Greenwood Gone. And we know it, we country dancers know it from Freed's verse 10 for the dance 10 for the 10 Commandments. And in the Fitzwilliam book, it's sometimes called Robin or Bonnie, Sweet Robin. Oops, we have a phone call there. Anyway, oops, Edmund's ducking out. So tunes in the Renaissance we call them vocally conceived. You could sing them. So small range, and they just move by step, easy to sing. And so that's a hallmark of those tunes. And Renaissance musicians, actually, let me play this tune first. But most musicians in the Renaissance wouldn't play it that way. You would always be, musicians were improvisers. And that, by the way, held true at least through the time of Chopin. You may have heard that. So Bach's day, musicians were improvisers. Chopin was an improviser. And in the Renaissance era, you would fill in the notes. So... and I'll even use the pedal, but I'll play Bonnie Sweet Robin or 10 for the Ten Commandments using the idea of some Renaissance ornaments. There were years ago I did play with a Renaissance group called Renaissonics. I played on the virginals on a Musolar, but those days are long gone, and my own improv, this will be a modern idea of Renaissance improv. You might have heard the buzzer go off because I went above the note that wouldn't be on the virginals. I went up to here, but that's not on the virginals. But it's really fun on the piano to do that. We've said the Playford book was published, the first one, the English Dancing Master, was published 1651, but many of the tunes in there have Renaissance roots. You can find concordances with Renaissance, with tunes from the Renaissance, or to me at least just have that sound, which we won't have time to get into today. Maybe on to the Baroque.
Jacqueline, that was great. So in this Baroque period, there was a lot of upheaval in the 1600s. John Playford first published his dance book, his first book, in the midst of political and cultural change. So how did the rules of music change?
The changes into the Baroque. So the Baroque period is often loosely considered from 1600 to 1750. And Bach, J.S. Bach, one of the very famous composers of the Baroque era, was 1685 to 1750. Handel, 1685 to 1759, and he became a naturalized citizen in the UK, and I think there's a number of English country dance tunes we can probably credit to Handel. Anyway, so those tunes, this gets to be music pulls away. I mean, it's still very important in worship services. That's where this vocally conceived music was really used. But in the Renaissance era, you have music, more music happening in the courts and in the world at large. That's a sort of loose statement there, but anyway, to say that it became instrumentally conceived, and so it means that you could have wide range. A tune might go like Barberina's tambourine. Try to sing that unless you're a trained opera singer. And so it would have jumps in it, which musicians would call arpeggios. So I'm going to play you an English dance tune, a snippet of it that we I haven't danced in years, but I remember Helena calling it at the dawn of time, maybe in the 70s, Ormond House, which has these jumping arpeggios in it. So, let's see here. What did I want to say? Oh, yeah. During the Baroque period, we also had the development of major music and major scales and minor scales. Whereas in the Renaissance, we had a different system of how music was organized into modes and much more complex, even more than modes that we talk about for folk music today. And also you got changes in how things were tuned. So eventually by the end of when Bach died, you could play in every key, and that's a whole other topic there. The modal tunes started to disappear. And also there were very complex rules, as there were many complex things during that era, for everything, behavior and dress and hand signals and everything. So there were for harmonic movement, what chord could follow what chord. It would be like having very much more complex grammar rules than we have today. I'll come back to that Cecil Sharp arrangement later. But also, imagine that we don't have piano yet. So if you're having a keyboard instrument, you're having this light, plucked sound, often augmented by cello or viol or lute or harp with the melodies above. But also, in both periods, you would have something called counterpoint or contrapuntal movement. That's when you have two voices playing off against each other. So like, I just sort of made that up, but in the Renaissance there were specific rules for how counterpoint worked, and those changed during the Baroque. And you might not hear many of those in dance music, but it's something I've incorporated to some extent, although often the counterpoint involved imitating. So you can hear two voices going where there's imitation going on between them. And too much of that drives dancers crazy now. They really like to hear the strong beat, but I love to put it in. It was also a very nuanced style, as I said. You could easily offend somebody in Baroque society. We're talking about high society because people didn't write very much about the lower classes. We know they danced, we know they played music, but not much was written about them in those days. But in the Baroque society, just a wrong hand gesture, you could lose your place at court forever. And same thing like that, just the wrong chord might be as bad as saying ain't in public society. So very, very, very nuanced. I'm going to play a minuet from a Bach partita, just the first part of it. It's the B-flat partita. And I'm going to play the other thing I forgot to say was that the ornamentation in the Baroque period, instead of ornamenting the whole line, you would just pick one note and you would just ornament it. You might still have some of the other kind of ornamentation, but once you start really listening to those different flavors, they do sound very different. And there were national styles too, and it gets very complicated, far beyond what I know. So here's the Bach minuet. I'm going to play as classical performers sometimes do now. It's repeated. So I'll play the first part, the A music, and then I'll repeat it I'll invent some Schwabized ornaments, not necessarily Baroque, but we'll see. And then I'll do the same thing with the second half of the music, and then I'll play it again with some ornaments. And no pedal. Now, I'm not a period player, but we do have within the CDS community some beautiful Baroque and Renaissance players. Hope you'll get to hear some of them someday. Come to Early Music Week or something. In our repertoire, some of the Baroque tunes that you would get, it's really a lot of our repertoire, the bulk of our repertoire, especially Cecil Sharp, but even some of our modern, you get the Purcell tunes like Hole in the Wall, Barberini's Tambourine, Maggot, Sally in Our Alley, etc., etc. Oh, I was going to play one more piece. I forgot. If we have time, I'm probably taking too much time. In the Baroque era is part of the era of science, development of science, and very rational, very logical, and logical constructions. Bach was extremely logical, but he also had a strong love of God as he understood it then. And so he has that beautiful Apollonian and Dionysian connection. He had both in his music. But pulse is often the backbone of the music. And let's see. Yeah, I'm going to play a Capriccio, and I also forgot to play another piece. We'll see if we can fit it in. Okay, here's the Capriccio first. This is from the C minor partita, and this is just half of it, a work in progress. Well, that's half the piece, and that's the fastest tempo I think I ever took it. I was listening to players last night, and I must have gotten too excited by this Argentine pianist who just took it like a bat out of hell. But that was the Capriccio, which is the final movement. I'm going to play something slower, much more nuanced, that might remind you of some of our triple time dances. Remember, we're way before anything to do with waltz. We're way before anything to do with waltz. So when we have triple time dances in the Baroque, they might have been triple time hornpipes like Hole in the Wall. They might have been minuets like the minuet I played, or they might have been more like the sarabande from Bach. Same partita. Take it away, Brad.
So that was the Baroque. A lot of my experience with the music comes from the dance. And in my sense of things, the dances we do of that era, of the Baroque era, um, were of one kind, one style. And then when we move beyond that, to the period beyond that, it becomes the dancing, the prevailing formation became long waves. The dances became simpler, a lot more repetition. So what happened in the music side of things when you moved from Baroque to classical? What were the changes?
And I'll mention that in the Baroque era and the classical era, country dance tunes were often plucked from operas and So there was a dialogue between this popular dance music and what people would go. I don't know that people had names for it like classical music, but in the classical era, which might be loosely described as 1750 to 1820, just like the dances became simpler in style, people weren't necessarily, this is for still people who didn't have to work for a living, but they're not royalty necessarily that are dancing now, like in the balls and Bath and big assemblies. They're not going to a dancing master every day. So dances are simpler, but also the classical music style became simpler and the dance music style became simpler. You get tunes that are the length of them is more like what we think of as a standard length now, 32 bars, AABB, for those of you teachers. And a lot of the modal music pretty much is out, and you get a simpler. So a lot of the tunes are in major, some of them are in minor for the dances, but heck of a lot of Yankee Doodle is a really typical late 18th century tune from the classical era. But in classical music, there's this huge development of style, which of form, which we don't necessarily have in the country dance music, the sonata style and these extended forms that led to concert music. I'm saying things very loosely here, but and there's this one accompaniment style. As I say, in the Baroque era, you might have these two equal voices, but in the classical era, it's more likely that you would have the opera singer out in front, or the violinist out in front of the texture, and in the back you'd have something that sounded more plucky, like, which you don't really want to hear by itself because it's really there just to support the melody. There's a name for a specific kind of that called the Alberti bass, but you get lots of accompaniments like that. And I'm going to, also, we finally get the piano, but it wasn't the modern piano. It was first developed in 1700, the forte piano, and it really means loud, soft. Forte, loud, piano, soft. So you get dynamics, but in the classical, a forte piano didn't get very loud and didn't get very soft, and it had a little bit of a pedal, but it still sounds a lot like a harpsichord in some ways. Yeah, and so we're into the Jane Austen era. Dances that we know lots of dances from that period. We don't do many of them because I say the tunes aren't that exciting, and the dances, the figures almost start to look, you could switch one for the other. But there are also some beautiful ones. Fandango really stands out from that's, I guess, 1770s. I'm just going to play a little snippet of a gorgeous piece that maybe you've heard, the middle, the slow movement from Beethoven's Pathetique sonata. But it has that, you'll hear that, listen for that repetitive accompaniment, which is not so repetitive because Beethoven was wonderful. and more to come. But that's that's a middle movement from Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata. So maybe we're gonna, I think we're gonna have an excursion to Scotland.
Jacqueline, I've heard you talk about the influence of Scottish music on the old English dance publications like the Neil collection. Can you describe that for us? Where did the Scottish music fit in?
Well, here's just an example rather than a whole exposition about it, but Scottish tunes appeared in the 18th century in English dance books. And in fact, there were whole books dedicated to, they call it Walsh, a very popular publisher of English country dance tunes, published several series of Caledonian country dance tunes. And there certainly would have been, politically and socially, there would have been dialogue back and forth between England and Scotland all the way through the 18th century. And maybe before. We don't know much about, I don't think, 17th century Scottish dancing. I think it was frowned on by the church. But these tunes came into English dancing. They were swept in, and we have many, many dances. Let's see, I wrote down some, but they didn't make that into this. Anyway, well, the Highland lilt that we do, and Braves of Dornoch, and anyway, tons of them. Even in the Neil collection, which was published in Ireland, of English country dances, you get tons of Scottish tunes, and this goes on through the century. Jacques Latin appeared as Jackie Latin, and anyway, lots of tunes, and they also had this vigorous, earthy sound. They draw on different scales. They're back to a different kind of modes. Some of them only use 5 notes in their scale, pentatonic. Well, oops, getting it wrong there. But anyway, so very simple and more primal sounding in some ways, some of those Scottish tunes. I'm going to play, and you get these drone accompaniments sort of sounding bagpipe-ish. So I'm going to play a strathspey that is from the late 18th century, honoring the great fiddler Neil Gow, although apparently not written by him. Neil Gow's style. So maybe on to the Romantic period.
So now we're up to 1820 and on. This is the period that Cecil Sharp was born into. We really have this last period before modern English country dancing exploded on the world. What was the music he grew up with? How would you describe the Romantic period?
Well, there was this great emphasis on individual expression and also narrative content. Sometimes music would be programmatic, would tell a story in the music. And I'm not saying that hadn't happened before, but it came to the fore in Romantic music, really exploiting a full range of emotions. Again, Bach might have a piece that sounds very sad, or we have country dances that sound very sad. And I know my band really has milked a lot of that with the Baroque music tunes, but this really came to the fore in this Romantic period. Alas, right when our genre was dying out, it was being supplanted by ballroom dancing like waltz and polka, and then the quadrilles. So you would get the same chords and the same materials of the music that were available before, the major and minor keys, but they got really exploited and extended during the Romantic era. And the piano really came into the fore there. The modern piano, I don't remember when it developed, when they got the maybe it was Steinway or whoever got the iron into the piano so that it wouldn't explode when it was tuned and played really heavily. And you would get this larger range of the piano and much louder and softer dynamics, greater range. And you'd get this rubato playing. And but before I say that, I just wanted to mention the pedal. I'm going to just play you a note without a pedal on the piano. As soon as you lift it up, it's gone. Here it is with the pedal. So that gives a lot more to play with as a pianist. I'm still worked up from playing that Scottish piece, and I'm going to try to calm myself down to play. I was going to talk about rubato. So one type of rubato that you hear in Chopin is that the left hand, the backbone of the music, would keep on going, but the right hand, you could fit your notes anywhere you wanted to. They didn't need to be metronomic, and that gives this expressive sense. I haven't mastered rubato for Chopin. I'm not really, again, not a Chopin player, but I love playing around with it. And so I'm going to play you just a little bit of one of the nocturnes, E flat, just the start of it. And you can listen again for the left hand. My left hand is going to be doing something you wouldn't want to hear on its own because it's just. So, and it really, but it's supporting the melody. was so distracted playing that because I was thinking about the rubato, and in the Baroque you had something called notes inégales, as I'm remembering from my music school, where notes could be unequal. It's not that this is a totally new thing, and we are always just reinventing the wheel in all these things. So I'm just sort of making artificial boundaries so you can get some idea. And we've said, I've just said the Romantic period was 1820 to 1900, but that is also where the waltz just blossoms, but in the country dancing we actually do see it earlier than that in the 1790s, but it was considered kind of like the lambada, just too shocking to do in public. So they would sneak it into the long way sets, like you would Duke of Kent's waltz and Prince William of Gloucester's waltz. And some of these you actually can waltz your partner down the set for about 4 waltzes, and that's all. And you have to remember that women were really corseted up, and they could easily faint, and it was considered what would happen if they fainted, even though there were all those people around. Nothing was going to happen. But anyway, it was considered very shocking and very romantic, and part of that era, and that really blossomed during the 19th century and supplanted to some extent, at least in the cities, the country dancing. You would get vestigial ones here and there at important times of the year. But I'm going to play a waltz tune that we know from 1821, North Down Waltz. And this is something that I do in my playing that drives some people crazy. So here's the tune. So if I played it really straight, it would be. But I have a little separation between my hands, and so sometimes my right hand hits the piano just a little bit later. And this really does drive some people crazy, and they say, I can't hear where the beat is. But it is, to me, part of that romantic affect. Anyway, I guess there it is. Anyway, here's North Down Waltz. So we're arrived, I think, at the
in the modern era.
20th century.
So Jacqueline, this is all, to my mind, giving us the framework of where Cecil Sharp's arrangements came from, which were not period, as we've talked about, but it's also leading up to your own musical background. How did you start? What did you start with? What was the music that brought you in?
Well, I started playing the piano when I was about 4 or 5 because my grandmother, Helen Schwab, was a classical pianist. And she stopped playing professionally when she married my grandfather, but she still continued she was quite a good classical pianist. She could just play rings around me with that. And she wasn't really interested in folk music. But I started with her, and it turned out, back to the beginning, when I'm copying out the Cecil Sharp arrangements, somewhere after I healed from the chicken pox, she came by the house and she saw the music and she said, "Cecil Sharp, I played for him." I was like, whoa. I mean, I was still in high school, and I didn't know enough to ask her questions about it. I mean, I was just really in the beginning of my love for English country dancing. And for her, it just would have been a gig, and I think, I don't even know if she played for country dancing or Morris dancing or sword dancing. He had pianists play for all those things. I think he had piano arrangements for all those. But it would have been about the time that he came through Pittsburgh that she would have been gigging. And so I think that's true. I had later learned that a Boston Center member, Naomi Dworkin, I learned this during a Boston social. Her grandmother also played for Cecil Sharp in New York. I hope I'm not outing her too much. I should have asked her permission. But anyway, she was a violinist and she played for Sharp in New York. But anyway, so my grandmother gave me my first lessons, but my formative teacher was a woman named Marjorie McCown, who was English, married to a Scot. And she had taught at the Eastman School of Music. And it turned out later that she also taught Phil Merrill, English country dance teacher Phil Merrill, many years before when he was a student there. I don't know the extent of their work together, but some of you here may remember Phil. I mean, he's just an amazing dance pianist with a twinkle in his eye. And, Kate Barnes is definitely in his, in the carried on that sense of Phil, and I'd say Karen Axelrod too. So Marjorie then came to Pittsburgh, and she taught at Chatham College, and I took theory and composition lessons with her. I could hardly play the piano at that point. I probably ADD, I don't know, but I didn't practice very much. I played a lot, but I took composition and theory and ear training lessons with her from age 8 to 12 or 13, and she was born around the same time as my grandmother, mid to late 1890s, and she loved. My grandmother was more of a Bach, Mozart, and then later in her life, Scriabin person. But Marjorie McCown grew up loving the turn of the century, the Impressionists, Debussy, Ravel. She introduced me to Erik Satie long before he became hot, and so I grew up with those kinds of harmonies in my head, which were many of the same ones that Sharp drew on. And in some ways, I haven't left that era in my bones or something. And Satie, and also to some extent Debussy and Ravel, were rejecting the over-romanticization of music that occurred in the Victorian era, and also the Victorian fussiness. So I'm going to play you a Satie piece. I actually composed one kind of like the Gymnopédies when I was 8 or 9. I'm not going to play that, but Satie, it was just very ironic in some way. This is 1890s music, but he would write, romantic music would write all these fevered inscriptions on the music about how you're supposed to play it. Satie would say, "Counsel." These are right in the score. "Counsel yourself," in French though. "Counsel yourself cautiously. Be clairvoyant. Alone for a second. Very lost. Carry this further. Think right and muffle the sound." That was Satie, who also wrote that he only ate white foods. I mean, he was misanthrope. He didn't get along very well with people, had huge fights with Debussy, and anyway, that's a whole other story, but he has stunning music. And so I'm going to play the third piece from his Nocien suite, which sounds a little bit like the Gymnopédies. He apparently made up this title Nocien. We don't know exactly what it means. People have posited different things for it. Anyway, and also his music doesn't have measure lines, doesn't have bar lines. There's no time signature. At least some of his music, including this Nocien. So maybe it's like E. Cummings leaving off capitals and punctuation in his poems, really extending things. Satie also collaborated with Picasso and Gertrude Stein. I think that piece has a little feeling of they drank a lot of absinthe in those days in the cafes. I'm gonna play a Ravel piece that this is a lifetime work, so this is work in progress. But from his wonderful piece Le Tombeau de Couperin. This is a whole suite that he wrote during the First World War. A horrible First World War where so many young men and some women in England and France and then eventually Americans died in just horrible war conditions where new weapons, but old-fashioned way of making war. So people were just mowed down and decimated. And in fact, the England that Cecil Sharp came back to after one of his American trips, there weren't any men left. They had all died in the war. Many of the young men had died, and a lot of the people who died were the creme de la creme from the universities. So Ravel dedicated the suite, each movement, to one of his friends who had died in the war. And this one is the prelude, and we'll see if my fingers will do it now. I've gotten so excited during this period, but we'll see. In some ways, you can imagine this as a rapper jig, but it's also, this was dedicated to this friend, and it's not sad music. Again, we've come away from the romantic of and but you get the sense that he loves this person so much he can hardly talk about the fact that he died because the piece is so quiet. And also you get the sense of this personality of this person with like champagne, like a buzzy person, always up to something. So we'll see how much of it I'll go through. The prelude is quite short, from Ravel's Tombeau de Couperin, which and the suite was a throwback. He has Baroque dance style, so it's in some way going back and honoring the Baroque period, but with modern harmony, which is in some way what Cecil Sharp did in his piano arrangements. Well, a work in progress. That piece goes actually twice as fast as that. You can listen to Angela Hewitt someday, but I'm just thrilled that I've gotten that far with it. But that leads us into, if we have any time, talking a little bit about the modern period and the Cecil Sharp period, and then on to other influences that I might have had.
Jacqueline, this would be great. We are running short. We might have to cut the end, but I feel listening to all this, starting with the music you played from the Renaissance through to the last, all these are elements of you, they're influences on you. I'd love to hear more about how Cecil Sharp fit into the music scene and what you took from there. What were your influences?
Well, again, Cecil Sharp, I think he was really coming out of this arts and crafts movement, and he had many motives. It was very nationalist, for better or worse, in hindsight, and today's how we look at it. But he was wanting to return and popularize the national music of England. The whole dance style he reconstructed was simple, and his arrangements were very simple. And again, we said that he was looking at them to just hand to a pianist. But I won't have time to read a quote, but I found a Vaughan Williams quote where he says people who criticized him, he really was moving in and out of the folk world that he was creating, and this whole English Folk Dance and Song Society organization that he took command of or formed, and he was still moving in the classical world. So Ralph Vaughan Williams wrote about him, and some of it was derogatory, and some of it was just saying Sharp really understood the melodies. And English music, especially that the Elizabethan and into the early Baroque era, they're just gorgeous melodies that we get out of English composers. But Sharp then applied these complex chords that you could even have in Bach, but in Bach's day you had to be really careful how you got into and out of them. But in Sharp's day you could just go. You just heard a lot of those in the Ravel. In Bach's day, you'd be fired if you went to and just plunked that chord down. It just would be shocking. And he also he found a lot of these modal tunes that I think were my entry into this music, and we still hear them. A lot of them if you go to here to the singing sessions at Pinewoods, you'll hear a lot of the modal tunes. That lonesome modal sound, and he really exploited that. But with my own playing, and there certainly is, when I started playing, everybody told me, well, I didn't play like Phil. Even 40 years into playing, there were some old timers who were saying, well, I love your playing, but I really loved Phil. Like that was the model that I could not ever surpass. And then when Bare Necessities made recordings, unfortunately, some other musicians were told, well, you don't sound like Bare Necessities. And now I think it's more open season, and it's really accepted that there's many styles. Certainly the way my band plays drew on the Sharp style, but it drew on all the personalities of our band. We don't have time to get into that today, but also I would just say that Earl has played a lot of Scottish music, which kind of sits back in the beat. And Kate and Mary at that time were playing a lot of Irish music, which at least in my understanding, or at least in their playing, really moves forward. We had a lot of clashes, rhythmic clashes in our band. I mean tempo, because we were sitting in different places in the music. English dance, if you dance in England, at least today, and also in the 80s when I first went over there, it's probably closer to how Earl sits in the beat. And there's some musicians who play for English dancing now who do that. I'm sort of AC/DC now. I've played for a lot for modern dance classes, which is very earthy, and you're sitting back in the beat, where I try to play blues. I channel my inner blues pianist, and I'm getting the dancers onto the floor. It's been about 20 years since I've done this, and then I play for ballet, where you're getting the dancers off the ground. Yeah. And instead of like, so there's different sounds, and I think I've become more flexible in my playing than I was last year. Anyway, 40 years ago. I was also very influenced by my studies at the New England Conservatory, where I was a teaching assistant for a 16th century counterpoint teacher, but also for Julia Sutton, who was headed the Collegium Terpsichore. She was an acknowledged expert in 16th century dance, and so that's when I started playing the harpsichord and understanding some of the differences there. I've also been influenced by loving the sound of Bartok, who has these sounds, sort of these Hungarian sounds in his playing. Very influenced by being a dancer myself, and I still play for some things and very influenced by Helena's style of teaching dance. And we don't skip very much anymore, but you'll still hear me playing for the skipping. Sometimes I actually get people to skip because trying to, without saying anything, just getting them to skip. But many of us don't want to skip anymore. I spent time in England when I was doing research that I talked about at the Five Things Zoom, and really got to hear some beautiful musicians over there who played so differently than I did, but that influenced me. You can't be around Kate Barnes too long without having humor, and I'm so serious, and so sometimes I'd be playing a Bare Necessities piece, and we don't talk in our group about what we're trying to do. We just jump in there and improvise, and I might be thinking, oh, this is this romantic moment in the dance, and suddenly Kate's going, like, oh, I slipped on a banana peel, like, and those things are going on at the same time, and I learned to be hopefully take myself a little less seriously. That's probably all of it. She said that it's this constant changing stew, and I think that's true of all of us. We were so lucky all over in the U.S. and other places to have live music for dancing. It has really transformed things. I would say that a lot of people think I play like I play on my recordings, but those are very constricted situations, and also they were so then. And the first Bare Necessities recording, 83, that's so then, and so constantly changing. And I think we are lucky to have so many musicians who are learning from each other and copying each other and then making their own style. And I think that's what I've done, and it really has been influenced a lot for me on which teachers I work with, but I was very strongly influenced by Helena. I think that's probably all to say. I've certainly been talking for a while. What should we do now? Shall we do one more version of King of Poland? What do you think? Okay, so this is, it's been a year since I played for a dance, but I'll try to pretend I'm playing for a dance. So back to the same piece that I started with, but more Schwabized. And Helena's used to, the first part of the dance where you turn your neighbor, we used to skip on that in the Boston dances. I don't know if people are still doing that now, but I'm going to see if I can have you hear where you might skip, just in case you were so inclined.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank
That
you.
low note is so Earl. That's how Earl loves to end a dance like that. He goes, and then dramatic low note. So you just copy everything you hear from. Anyway, thank you so much, Brad.
I have one more thing to ask of you. We're going to run just a bit over time. I've been trying actually to feed the questions into the chat line. There weren't many questions. I mostly got to them. We'll see how they go. One of the things, Jacqueline, one of the things I've enjoyed knowing about you all these years is the wide breadth of music you play. And I really appreciated your sharing that wide breadth today. I've often felt the English dancers who dance to your music see one set of you, and I'm glad to expand that view. But what are you working on today? What's your
Oh,
you had one more piece you wanted to play. I would like to
there
leave.
was one more piece I would love to play. I don't know if it's in me again,
Oh,
but we'll see. I've been exploring my folk dance roots with all this talk of immigration. I've been doing two concerts, one of vintage Latin music, which I did recently under the aegis of Lisa Greenleaf's brother, who operates a wonderful performing group performance center. I've lost it totally. I'm gone for the afternoon. In Stonington, Connecticut. But I've also been doing a program exploring immigrants, music of American immigrants, and this piece is actually in both concerts. It's by Brazilian composer Ernesto Nazaré, who composed turn of the 20th century. And he was a dance pianist for most of his life, but then concert pianist, and he, getting my fingers back while I'm talking, he did influence some classical composers who took his sort of simple, it's not so simple for me because I'm not Brazilian, but it's his simple dance things and made them much more complex. So the composer Mio and the composer Norman Dello Gioio both took Nazaré's ideas. And this is before samba and etc. So this is a piece called Carioca, dedicated to the people of Rio, Carioca, according to my Brazilian neighbor. I'm sort of trying to pronounce it, Carioca. And you'll hear this undulating dance rhythm in the bass for the first half, and the melody is supposed to ride, I think, on top of it, again, not being exactly metrical. And then the second half is going to second part will sound a little more like ragtime. See if my fingers will play it. I just want to say one more thing. A big, big thanks to Brad for exploring these questions, which I think we share. And I met Brad when I think we haven't figured out if it was 71 or 72. My first year at Pine was a 71. I'm not sure if we figured that out. But anyway, we've known each other a long time. And in some ways, it's like family. You go back to the self that you were way back then. And certainly in this program, I've been revisiting that to some extent. And but I think this is just of interest to our whole community. And so I just want to thank him for and I hope I can't wait to see what else he's gonna put out for the rest of the series.
Thank you, Jacqueline. This was wonderful. I really appreciated all you brought to this. I really appreciated all the work you put into it. It was a huge job putting this together, and I'm very grateful for that. I want to again give my thanks to Boston Center, CDS Boston Center. They gave so much to this project, and to our crew. I've put up a little slide of contact information if you want to reach us.